This is the story of how to have a holiday on a shoestring budget and return home at the end of it with a bird in a box. So, when I had my first proper holiday, it was in the 1960s. I was 18 years old. But I believe I had two holidays before that. The very first one was actually a day out, but to me it was a holiday. I was 3 years old, it was 1953, and my mum and dad took me to the beach in Bournemouth, all the way from landlocked Wiltshire. Fantastic. I'd never seen the sea before or a beach before. Fabulous. I was only 3 years old. Something I've always done in life is enjoyed wandering. And at 3 years of age, I enjoyed wandering, so I got lost. And I can remember the horror of that day to this day. I wandered off and all I could see were legs, nothing but legs, legs and more legs. Trouser legs with trousers rolled up to the knees, women's skirts rolled up and tucked into their knicker elastics. All I could see was nothing but legs and sand, and I was terrified. Everything must have worked out okay, because I remember just staying with my mum and dad for the rest of that day out on Bournemouth Beach, and we went home, and I decided I never wanted to go on a holiday to a seaside ever again. That was 1953, what I consider to be my first holiday. My second holiday was in 1960, when I was 10 years old. By then we'd moved to Shetland. We were living in the island of Yell, and my poor mum had been through a really tough time in her life, really difficult. She was exhausted, and of course she'd never had a holiday apart from a day out to Bournemouth 7 years previously. So she was desperate for some sort of a break. Me, my mum and my sister Margaret were living with poor old Grandad, who was blind, and he wanted mum to get away for a little break. Our dear neighbours were willing to help out by looking after Grandad while we were away. So we went away for a weekend. We were invited by a friend of my mum's called Joan Moore, who lived in a place called Skeld on the Shetland mainland. It was big excitement going there, getting there. Well, first of all, we had to get to the south of Yell. We had to cross Yell Sound in a small wooden boat, and then get a bus all the way to Lerwick, a bus from Lerwick all to Skeld, all the way to Skeld. By the time we got there, we were all exhausted. My poor mum, she was already exhausted with life. She arrived for her little weekend exhausted, but Saturday and Sunday lay ahead when she was going to relax and thoroughly enjoy herself. The house had electricity, running water, all sorts of things that we didn't have in Yell. So it was going to be a wonderful couple of days for her. So on Saturday, Margaret and I received some very serious warnings. We were not to go down to the seashore, down to the banks. The banks apparently were cliffs or became cliffs and were quite dangerous. So we solemnly promised not to go there. So instead we went everywhere else that was available. I've never been back to Skeld, but I seem to recall it as being quite a scattered crofting community. So all there was to do was to leg it from the croft that we were staying on to the next croft, which was fine, and we spoke to one or two people, and the next croft, and that was fine, and we chatted with folks there, and then the next croft, where there was to us an old lady, and she chatted with us and we chatted with her, and it was wonderful. And she invited us to come in, and we must be thirsty. Oh, you bet we were thirsty. Yes, a glass of milk or a glass of juice, most welcome, thank you very much, old lady. And we had a wonderful time with her. She had some home baking. Were we hungry? Oh, you bet we were hungry. Home baking, fruit cake, bannocks, pancakes. It was all there. She was so lovely, so generous, and we were made to feel most welcome for an hour or two possibly even more, by which time, as far as my mum was concerned, it was lunchtime, or dinner time as it was called back then, and we were nowhere to be seen. She looked, and her friend Joan looked for us, couldn't find us anywhere, searched in the outhouses, the byre, the lamb shed, nowhere to be seen. We had completely vanished off the face of the earth. Mum had a dog whistle with her. She always called us with a dog whistle. We knew our whistle, but we were indoors, far, far away, enjoying good grub and conversation with this little old skilled lady. According to Mum later on, a search party was sent out to scour the banks, the cliffs. Men went out with binoculars to see if we'd taken off on a raft out to sea or something. Poor Mum, who was there for a bit of a break, was absolutely frantic with worry. And of course, in due time, Margaret and I rolled up as right as rain, not a care in the world, having completely destroyed, completely ruined our mother's little bit of a break. Sunday was a proper Sunday, a quiet day, and I think it maybe gave Mum a little bit of chance to recover. And then, of course, it was the long trek back home to Yale. So that was the second family holiday that we'd had, and it was a disaster. So, by the time I was 18 in 1968, those, as far as I was concerned, were the two holidays that I'd had in life. I had two friends, Colin and Arthur, who suggested that maybe we could go for a holiday together, the three of us. I wasn't too keen on the idea because they were talking of going to Aberdeen, and I was still just at school then, had no money. I couldn't afford to go on holiday to Aberdeen. And there'd been a rather sad incident in the family. The family budgie had died. So the poor thing had been buried in the garden, and its cage and its leftovers of trill seed and cuttlefish and whatnot were all put up in the loft. But I was persuaded on this Aberdeen holiday by, I think there was a bit of misunderstanding. I thought digs were going to be available free of charge, and all I needed to do was shell out for the fare on the ferry going from Lerwick to Aberdeen and back again, and a bit of spending money in Aberdeen. That was all that was needed. So on that basis, I was persuaded to go on this holiday with Colin and Arthur, and off we went. It was a rough trip south. We boarded with a carry-out of McEwan's export beer, and we went to the extent of sharing a cabin for six with three strangers who equally had carry-outs of McEwan's export, and we had a fine party. A fine time was had by all, and the night soon passed by, and in the morning we arrived in Aberdeen, and we stepped out onto the quayside, where I then understood, and it became very clear, that digs were not available, certainly not for free, and we ended up wandering Union Street looking for somewhere to stay, and found a bed and breakfast place at the top end of Union Street, overlooking the junction, Holborn Junction, and we stayed with a Mrs. Patterson. And we were quite impressed by it, because we looked down onto the junction, and back in the 60s, this was 1968, mods and rockers, there were guys on scooters and motorbikes who would rev their engines at the traffic lights at Holborn Junction and then race down to the next set of traffic lights, disappear and race back again. We had a great window, a great view, and this was going to be a great holiday, apart from the fact that I was going to be skint having to shell out for this bed and breakfast. But friend Colin had quite a good idea. He was going to introduce us to gambling, and he took us to the Cheval Casino in Belmont Street. That was fine. I had never been to any sort of place like this before in my life. Uh, there were a couple of heavies, big bouncer guys on the door, who let us in on condition that we signed the guest book. So we put some fake names and made up some fake addresses and went downstairs into the basement, where it was very smoky and quiet, and everybody was very well dressed, and us three scruffy Shetlanders tiptoed around. Colin knew what was what. He showed us all the various tables and that, and who did what and how to do it. And he very kindly bought me, anyway, a couple of chips just to try out. Now, I knew that whatever I did with these two chips, they would soon disappear. So I took an interest in the roulette wheel. And I realised that not only could you gamble on numbers, you could gamble on just simply red or black. And my logic told me that if you waited long enough and two and certainly three of the same colour came up one after the other, then if those were three reds, it was a certainty that the next colour would be a black. So I put a chip down on a black and got two chips back in return. Oh, fantastic. So I waited long enough, did the same thing again, put two chips down this time and got four back. A way of making money, dead easy, except the guy that was sitting there, what do you call him, a croupier, was kind of looking at me, so I just wandered off and pretended I wasn't interested, and a while later kind of kept an eye on things and sneaked in with another three, probably four chips and doubled them again. We came out of the Cheval and I'd made a bit of money. And I realised I was going to have a holiday after all. This was wonderful. I could pay for the B&B and, more importantly, I was going to be able to get home, because there was only one way of getting home, and that was by sea. There's no way of stealing a bicycle or cycling home or anything like that, or walking home. We had to go home in the boat. So, excellent. I was going to have a great holiday. So, the first thing, Colin had other things to do. Me and Arthur were on our own, and one thing we really wanted to do, coming from Shetland, was to take a coach trip. And I'll tell you why in a moment. We went to McIntyre's coach tours, and we went into their office. There was a young girl there who asked us how she could help, and we said we looked at some leaflets and said we wanted to go for a coach trip up Royal Deeside. She said, Royal Deeside? Here's a couple of long-haired, scruffy Shetlanders. And of course, coach trips in those days, it was only old ladies, or at least what to us teenagers were old ladies. It was only old ladies that went on these trips. And this girl obviously realised we just didn't fit in at all. There was something fishy going on here. And oddly, she went and got her boss through. I wonder if it was Mr. McIntyre himself. I don't know. Anyway, it was an older guy who came through and said, now boys, how can I help you? We said, we want to go on a coach trip up Royal Deeside, please. And he says, do you now? He says, why would you want to go up Royal Deeside? We said, we want to see some trees. He said, why do you want to see trees? We said, well, we're on holiday and we've come down from Shetland and there aren't any trees up Shetland. We want to see some trees. He says, well, Royal Deeside is the place for trees. He said to the girl, give them their tickets, lass. And we got our tickets and got on a bus with about 40 old white-haired ladies. And us two scruffy teenagers, off we went. And we saw trees after trees after trees. It was fantastic. And we thoroughly enjoyed ourselves with these old ladies who were quite bemused at us two scruffy fellows accompanying them. But anyway, a fantastic day out, and we saw trees. The next thing we wanted to experience was a train, because there were and there are no trains in Shetland, so we had no knowledge of trains at all. We went down to Aberdeen train station and we asked for 2 return tickets to the nearest place, the shortest journey, because we weren't interested in the scenery or going anywhere. We were just interested in being on a train. So we were told Stonehaven was the place to go to, and we got 2 returns to Stonehaven. Excellent, off we went, and not long after we arrived in Stonehaven. Now, we were 2 lads who were very used to boats and ships and ferries and the likes, so we were used to a boat coming in and docking and tying up and gangplanks being lowered and all that sort of stuff. So we thought that when a train came into a station, everything would be at a leisurely pace. So people got off and started leaving, and doors were slamming. By the time we wandered to the door, we couldn't figure out how to open it. There was no handle on it. What we didn't realise was that back in those days, you had to slide the window down and open, lean out, and the handle was on the outside. And then you opened the door, closed the window, and slammed it shut. We didn't know that. This was a door without a handle. Help! So we scurried to the next available door. It didn't have a handle either. Its handle was missing as well. And we tore down the length of the next coach to get to the... And by the time we got there, not only was it yet another door with a missing handle, but the damn train was moving. We were off. And we didn't know where it was going to go to. We had no idea of the lay of the land in the east of Scotland. And as it happened, we had to sit down and wait until we got to Montrose. We had no idea what was in Montrose, what it was like, and what we were going to do. What we did know was that on the train there was a ticket collector, a guy going around asking for tickets from Stonehaven. So we had to hide in the toilets and all sorts of things to keep out of his way. And then when we got to Montrose, we got off, we realised there was a man standing at a gateway taking everyone's tickets as they left. We didn't have a ticket. We were in serious trouble. Plus, I didn't have much in the way of cash. So, to my shame today, we broke the law. We legged it down the platform until we got to the end, on to the gravel and the hardcore, ran down that until the security fence, a kind of a tall white wooden fence with a pointy top on it, gave way to a much lower fence, and we hopped over and just ran. Now, it so happens that in Montrose, basically whichever direction you go in, more or less takes you to the town centre. We got to the town centre, found a pub, went in, bought 2 pints of beer, and sat down and wondered how we were going to resolve this difficulty. The beer was awful. We'd never tasted anything dreadful in all our lives. All we were used to in Shetland was McEwen's Export, and better still, Carlsberg Special. That to us was beer. This was like dishwater. It was awful. Anyway, we drank it and decided the only way we're ever going to get back to Aberdeen, because we had no idea how far away we were, was to get back to the train station and get back up. I think we inquired of the publican about trains and stations, because by the time we got to the train station, we knew there was such a thing as a platform ticket. So for a few pennies, you could buy a platform ticket, and that allowed you to get into the station and meet a friend off a train. So we went to the other side of the railway line, waited for a train to come on. As it came in, we hopped on. We had no friend to meet. We hopped on and spent the whole journey from Montrose to Stonehaven hiding from the ticket inspector, hiding in the toilets and here, there and everywhere. And with great relief we got to Stonehaven, and we had tickets, our return tickets back to Aberdeen, got back to Aberdeen, and all was well. That was fine. So that was our train experience. Now, the final difficulty was I was still short of cash to get back home on the ferry. And we wanted to experience just 1 or 2 other things on our last day in Aberdeen. You know, there were shops and things to buy and that. And I realised that if you lived in a city, if there was a casino, this was like a cash machine, today's cash machines. You could go in, it took a little bit of time, but you came out with money. So round about midnight, our last night in Aberdeen, I took myself down to the Cheval, signed in on a different name, different address, went downstairs and spent about 2 hours just hovering around the roulette table, just keeping an eye on reds and blacks, and then swiftly moving in and putting my chips down and getting twice as many in return. And yeah, I had to be careful. I had to go off on wander around the place and pretend I was doing other things on other tables. But all I knew anything about was reds and blacks on the roulette, and I made quite a bit. So much, in fact, that the next day, me and Arthur and Colin were able to treat ourselves to a Chinese meal in Aberdeen. We'd never had Chinese food before. Another wonderful experience. And finally, I realised there was enough money left over for something that deep in my heart I wanted to do. Remember I told you how the family budgie had died and we still had its cage and everything. It would be wonderful if I could find a pet shop and buy another budgie, because in Shetland there were no pet shops. Budgies were thin on the ground in Shetland. I mean, men going to sea would come back with all sorts of creatures and animals. My mum, when she was a little girl, had a tortoise. My granddad brought it back from Morocco for her. It lasted about a year and the poor thing died. A lady not far from us had a parrot. It did survive, and I think it was her father, probably her grandfather, that brought it home. She'd had it for donkey's years. Someone else, I remember my mum telling me someone had a monkey not far from where we lived, and I think it didn't last its first winter in Shetland. But budgies, yeah, people had budgies, but you couldn't buy these things in Shetland. People brought them home with them. So we set off, and I found a budgie shop. I found a pet shop, and I had enough to buy a budgie. And the shop owner put it in a little cardboard box with some seed and tied a little bit of string on the top, and off I went with this budgie in a little cardboard box. Now, therein lay a bit of a problem, because the little cardboard box was meant for a purchaser to take on an Aberdeen bus, go straight home and put it in a cage. I was going to go down to Aberdeen Harbour later on that day, board a ferry and go overnight back up to Lerwick and then find my way home 15 miles from Lerwick. Quite a few hours were involved, during which time the budgie started to get a bit fed up. We got on the ferry and left. That was fine. We were in a cabin. We had a cabin again. The money stretched to that. And in the cabin were some heating pipes across the ceiling. So I was able to tie the budgie box to the heating pipes, and it swung underneath them, reasonably happy with the motion of the ship. Unfortunately, Arthur's Chinese meal disagreed with him. Yes, so he ended up semi-conscious. So I left him to look after my new budgie acquisition while Colin showed me round the St. Clair. And back in those days, it was great. You could go anywhere. You could go right up to the bow of the ship and lean over and watch the bow wave. And admittedly in a storm, the doors were locked. You weren't allowed to go out, but you could go anywhere. And we went right down into the engine room, and the engineers down there showed us around. We had a great time, knowing that Arthur was looking after my budgie in its cardboard box. We got back to our cabin for a good night's snooze, but I did notice that the holes that were punched in the box for ventilation were slightly larger than they were previously. But no great worries. Lights out, and we went to sleep, and the budgie went to sleep as well. We came into Lerwick probably 7 o'clock in the morning, and the budgie woke up, and the budgie decided it was time to escape. And it started enlarging the holes, making them bigger and bigger. And I still had 15 miles to travel to get back home. And this damn budgie ended up with a hole so big that its head was sticking out. Now, I can't remember exactly how I got home. I think we got a lift. But the budgie, by then, had 2 or 3 holes that were head and shoulder size, and by the time I got home it was almost out of its cardboard box and I was having to keep poking it back in. But the good news is that we got it in its cage and it had a very, very happy time in Shetland. But only for a year, because we left Shetland after a year. And that budgie that had made the trip all the way to Shetland on the St. Clair, 1 year later made the journey all the way back again to live for the rest of its life to a ripe old age in Arbroath. So I'm wondering if anybody else out there has a budgie that made 2 trips, one all the way to Shetland and another one all the way back again. Possibly, maybe not, but my one certainly did, and lived a very happy life thereafter.